Well, let me tell you something strange about your mind. You have been alive for thousands of days, tens of thousands maybe. You have experienced sunrises and meals and the feeling of cloth against your skin. You have heard voices, felt temperature, tasted food. But if I asked you to remember your first birthday, you would come up empty. Your second birthday, nothing. Your third, maybe fragments, but probably not. And this is not because you forgot. It is because those memories were never written down in the first place. Now, this seems impossible. You were there, you were conscious. You experienced those moments as vividly as you experience this moment right now. A baby feels hunger. A toddler feels joy when someone plays peekaboo. These are real experiences happening to a real conscious mind. So where did they go? And here is what makes this really interesting. It is not just you. Every human being has this gap. We call it childhood amnesia. The average person cannot recall any specific episodic memories from before age 3 or 4. Some people push it back to age 2 with effort, but even then, researchers are not sure if those are real memories or constructed from photographs and family stories. For all practical purposes, the first 3 to 4 years of your conscious existence are gone, completely inaccessible. You see, most people assume memory works like a video recorder. Experience happens, brain records it, memory exists. Simple. But that is not quite right. And the reason it is not quite right tells us something profound about what consciousness actually is. Not what we imagine it to be, what it physically is. There was no magic moment when you became conscious. You did not suddenly wake up at age 4 and start existing. But there was a moment, or rather a gradual period, when your brain developed the physical machinery to write experiences into long-term storage. Before that machinery existed, experiences happened, but they left no trace, like writing on water. Now, to understand why this happens, we need to talk about what memory actually is at the physical level. And I mean really physical, not metaphorical, not abstract. What is happening inside your skull when you remember something? Memory is not stored in one place. It is not like your brain has a filing cabinet where experiences get tucked away. Memory is a pattern. Specifically, it is a pattern of connections between neurons. You have about 86 billion neurons in your brain. Each neuron can form up to 10,000 synaptic connections with other neurons. When you experience something, a specific pattern of neurons fires. If that pattern gets reinforced, if those neurons fire together repeatedly, the connections between them strengthen. We have a saying in neuroscience: neurons that fire together wire together. This is not metaphor. The synaptic connection physically changes. Proteins get synthesized. Receptor molecules move to different positions on the cell membrane. The actual structure of the synapse is modified at the molecular level. This is what memory is. Changed molecules. Think about that for a second. Every memory you have, every face you recognize, every song you can hum, every skill you have learned, exists as a specific configuration of proteins and receptor molecules distributed across millions of synaptic connections. Change those molecules, the memory changes. Destroy those molecules, the memory is gone. But here is the thing. For this to work, you need the machinery in place. You need the neurons to be connected properly. You need the biochemical pathways that strengthen synapses to be functional. You need structures that coordinate all of this. And in a newborn baby, you do not have all of that yet. The most important piece is a structure called the hippocampus. It sits deep in your brain, one on each side, shaped roughly like a seahorse, which is what hippocampus means in Greek. The hippocampus does not store memories, but it is absolutely critical for forming new episodic memories. Episodic memories are memories of specific events: what you had for breakfast, the conversation you had yesterday, your first day of school. These are different from procedural memories, like how to walk or how to recognize a face, which use different brain systems. When you experience something, sensory information comes in. Visual, auditory, tactile, whatever. That information gets processed in various parts of your cortex. The hippocampus takes all those separate pieces and binds them together into a coherent episode. It creates an index, essentially, that links all the different components of the experience. Later, when you try to remember, the hippocampus helps you retrieve that index and reactivate the pattern. Without a functioning hippocampus, you cannot form new episodic memories. We know this from patients who have suffered hippocampal damage. The most famous case is a man known as H.M. In 1953, he had surgery to control severe epilepsy. The surgeons removed large portions of his hippocampus on both sides. The surgery stopped the seizures, but it left H.M. unable to form new memories. He could remember things from before the surgery. He could hold information in his mind for a few minutes if he concentrated. But the moment he got distracted, the information vanished. Every time he met his doctor, it was the first time. He lived in a continuous present, unable to encode new experiences into long-term storage. Now, here is the critical point. In human infants, the hippocampus is not fully developed at birth. It is there, but it is immature. The neurons are not all in place. The connections are not fully formed. The biochemical machinery is not operating at full capacity. Development continues after birth. The hippocampus does not reach functional maturity until around age 3 or 4. Before that, you are essentially living in HM's world. Experiences happen. You are conscious. You feel things. But the machinery to write those experiences into retrievable long-term memory does not exist yet. And you know what? Even when the hippocampus matures, that is not the end of the story. Because memory is not just about storage, it is about retrieval. And retrieval requires pathways. When you remember something, you are reactivating a pattern of neural firing. But to do that, your brain needs to find that pattern again. It needs retrieval cues. Context. Associations. Adults have a lifetime of context to hang memories on. When you experience something new, you automatically connect it to things you already know. You encode it using language. You relate it to similar experiences. You have a narrative structure for your life, a sense of self that persists over time. All of this provides scaffolding for memory. A 2-year-old has almost none of that. Their language skills are rudimentary. Their sense of self is just beginning to form. They do not have decades of prior memories to provide context. Even if a memory gets encoded, the retrieval pathways are weak. The memory exists, maybe, but there is no road back to it. So, childhood amnesia is not one thing. It is several things happening together. Immature hippocampus means encoding is poor. Lack of language means memories are not verbally tagged. Absence of a stable self-concept means no narrative structure. Underdeveloped retrieval pathways mean even if something got encoded, you probably cannot find it again. All of this is physical. Neurons developing, synapses forming, molecules changing position. There is no mystery here, no magic. Memory requires specific physical structures operating in specific ways. Before those structures exist, memory does not exist. Now, this raises a question that makes some people uncomfortable. If your earliest memories do not exist, what does that mean about your sense of self? You think of yourself as a continuous entity, the same person who has existed since birth. But you have no access to the first several years of that existence. For all practical purposes, that time might as well have happened to someone else. You see, we like to think of consciousness as fundamental, something that just is. But what if consciousness is not fundamental at all? What if it is something that emerges from physical processes, from neurons firing in particular patterns, from information being encoded and retrieved in specific ways? When you were 1 year old, something was experiencing the world through your eyes. But was it you? It had none of your memories. It could not form new memories that you could later access. It had no language, no narrative, no continuous sense of self over time. In what sense was it the same entity you are now? This is not a thought experiment. This is biology. The physical structures that create your sense of continuous identity did not exist yet. And if those structures create identity, then before they existed, that identity did not exist either. I am not saying babies are not conscious. They clearly experience things. They feel pain and pleasure. They have preferences. But consciousness and memory are not the same thing. You can be conscious in the moment without encoding that moment into retrievable long-term storage. Every person with hippocampal damage proves this. They are conscious. They are aware. They simply cannot remember 5 minutes ago. Babies are in that state all the time, perpetually conscious, perpetually unable to remember. And here is where it gets really strange, because even though you cannot remember being a baby, those experiences still affected you. Not as explicit memories, as something else, patterns in how you respond to things, emotional associations you cannot explain, preferences you do not remember forming. Your brain was learning the whole time. Procedural learning, emotional learning, all of that was happening. It just was not forming explicit episodic memories. So you were shaped by experiences you cannot recall. The person you are now was partly constructed by events that are completely inaccessible to your conscious mind. Think about that. You're walking around with a personality, with habits, with emotional responses that were created by experiences you have zero access to. It is like someone else programmed part of your mind and did not leave you the source code. Now, some people find this disturbing. The idea that consciousness is not some eternal soul inhabiting a body, but a process that emerges from physical structures that take years to develop. The idea that your earliest self is not you, not really, because the machinery that creates continuity of self did not exist yet. But I think there is something beautiful about it too, because it means consciousness is not magic, it is physics. It is neurons forming connections, molecules changing configuration, information being encoded and retrieved through specific biochemical processes. And we are figuring out how it works. In the 1990s, neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire did brain scans of London taxi drivers. London taxi drivers have to memorize the entire city, 25,000 streets. It takes years. Maguire found that their hippocampi were physically larger than average, specifically the posterior portion, which is involved in spatial memory. And the longer someone had been a taxi driver, the larger that region was. The brain is not fixed. It changes based on what you do with it. Use a memory system intensively, that system grows. Stop using it, it shrinks. This is not metaphor. The actual volume of brain tissue changes. More recently, researchers have been studying how early life experiences affect brain development. Children raised in severe deprivation, in orphanages where they receive minimal interaction, show measurable differences in hippocampal development. The structure is smaller. Memory formation is impaired. And this can have lasting effects. But here is the hopeful part. The brain is plastic. If you intervene, if you change the child's environment, provide stimulation and interaction and care, the hippocampus can catch up. Development can resume. New connections form. The machinery repairs itself. This happens because the brain is not a finished product. It is a process. It is constantly building itself in response to experience. And that process starts before birth and continues for decades. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning and decision-making and impulse control, does not finish developing until your mid-20s. The brain you have right now, if you are under 25, is not the brain you will have in 10 years. It is still under construction. And this tells us something important. You are not a fixed thing. You are a process, a pattern of information being constantly updated and revised. Your memories change every time you recall them, because the act of remembering modifies the synaptic connections. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, not just psychologically but physically. Most of the molecules in your body have been replaced. The patterns persist, but the substrate is new. So when people ask, why can't you remember being born? The answer is simple. The physical machinery required to encode that experience into retrievable long-term memory did not exist yet. You were there, you were conscious, but the you that could remember, the you that has narrative continuity, had not been constructed yet. And that raises one more question. If memory requires specific physical structures, and those structures take years to develop, and even then they are constantly changing and updating, what does that mean about the nature of self? Most people think of themselves as a continuous entity, the same person from birth to death. But physically, that is not true. You are a pattern of information instantiated in molecules that get replaced. The pattern persists. The molecules do not. And if a gap in the pattern, like childhood amnesia, does not break your sense of continuity, what does that tell you? You feel like the same person despite having no memories of your first 3 years. You feel like the same person even though your brain has physically changed, even though the molecules are different, even though your personality and preferences have shifted. So, what is the self? It is not the molecules. They change. It is not the memories. Some are gone, others are modified every time you access them. It is not even the pattern, because the pattern changes too. Maybe the self is the story you tell about the pattern, a narrative that creates continuity even where physical continuity does not exist. A story that starts arbitrarily around age 3 or 4, because that is when the machinery to encode the story came online. Before that, the book had no pages. Experience happened, but it was not being written down. And here we are, made of this stuff, these changeable molecules and shifting patterns, trying to understand how we work. Using brains to study brains, using memory to investigate why memory sometimes does not form. There is something remarkable about that. We are the universe trying to understand itself. Atoms arranged in such a way that they became conscious and started asking questions. And one of the first questions is, why can't I remember my beginning? The answer is not mystical, it is not philosophical, it is physical. You need a hippocampus, you need synaptic plasticity, you need biochemical pathways that strengthen connections between neurons. You need retrieval cues and narrative structure and language to tag experiences. And you did not have those things yet. So your beginning is gone, not forgotten, because it was never written down, not repressed, because there is nothing to repress, simply absent, because the machinery to record it did not exist. But the remarkable thing is this: even though you cannot access those memories, they still shaped you. The experiences you cannot recall still built the foundation of who you are. Your brain was learning the whole time, even if it was not forming explicit memories. Patterns were being laid down, connections were being made, the structure was being built. And then, around age 3 or 4, something changed. The hippocampus matured. Language developed. A sense of self started to form, and suddenly experiences started sticking. You could remember yesterday. You could remember last week. You started building the narrative of your life. That narrative has gaps, holes where memories should be but are not. But you tell the story anyway. You construct a continuous self from discontinuous data. You are the author of your own autobiography, starting chapter 1 at age 4, because the pages before that are blank. And that is how it works. That is the physical basis of memory and consciousness and self. Neurons and synapses and molecules changing position. Nothing mystical, nothing magical, just physics and chemistry doing what physics and chemistry do. But you know what? That does not make it less amazing. It makes it more amazing. Because it means we can study it, we can understand it, we can figure out how experience becomes memory, how memory becomes self, how self becomes consciousness. We're not all the way there yet. Nobody knows exactly how neural activity becomes subjective experience. Nobody knows why it feels like something to be you. These are open questions, but we are making progress. We are mapping the brain. We are understanding memory formation. We are watching consciousness emerge from physical processes in real time. And maybe someday we will understand it completely. Maybe someday we will know exactly why you cannot remember being born, not just in terms of hippocampal development and synaptic plasticity, but in terms of the fundamental relationship between matter and mind. But for now, we know this much. Memory is physical. Consciousness emerges from structure. And the you that remembers is not the you that experienced. There is a gap there. A gap where you existed but could not record your existence. And that gap is not a mystery, it is neuroscience. It is the story of a brain building itself, one connection at a time, until finally it built the machinery to remember its own construction. Think about that. You spent the first years of your life building the very system you would later use to remember your life. You were the construction crew working on a building, that would eventually house your memories. But the building was not finished yet, so the crew's work was never recorded. And now here you are, living in that building, with no memory of how it was built. That is childhood amnesia. That is the physical basis of why you cannot remember being born. And that, I think, is one of the most profound things about human consciousness. We are processes, not things, patterns, not objects, stories we tell ourselves, built from incomplete data held together by molecules that were not there 10 years ago and will not be there 10 years from now. And somehow, against all odds, it works. You wake up every morning feeling like the same person. You have continuity. You have identity. You have a sense of self that persists even though the physical substrate constantly changes, even though your earliest chapters are missing, even though memory itself is unreliable and reconstructive. The self is a story the brain tells itself. And like all good stories, it starts in the middle, with the protagonist already in motion, the backstory lost to time. And that is how it is. That is what we are. Storytelling machines made of meat and electricity, writing our own narratives on hardware that took years to finish installing. That is science. That is the material basis of mind. And that is beautiful.